Welcome back to Tiny Grimes Games, and I'm here with another Star Wars Destiny video. And today I want to talk about resources and building your Destiny decks, knowing and thinking carefully about how incredibly valuable resources are. I would say resources are more valuable in Destiny than in any game I've ever played. And so what I mean by this is if you look at a card, for instance, that costs 1 versus one that costs 2, in every other game I've ever played, I've went, I mean, that's a little bit of a difference. Like, it's basically the same. If you're playing Game of Thrones, if a card costs 2 versus 1, it can be a pretty big difference, but it's usually not that bad. In Destiny, it is a huge difference. It is light years difference, and that's because of the controlled economy that you're getting. You're only getting 2 resources every turn. If something costs 2, that is your whole turn unless you are able to find another way to generate resources. If something only costs you 1, well, now you get the opportunity to play 2 1-cost cards. And that is a huge difference in this game, especially if you can play a card with a die for only 1. The more dice you can get out, the better shape you are generally in, as long as these dice are having some sort of impact. So let's go ahead and start with this comparison of cards that are 2 costs versus 1 cost for the purpose of mitigation, as I call it, of some sort of dealing with your opponent's roll. Your opponent had a great roll. Oh no, how are we going to deal with it? Now, if you pay 2 to deal with it, you are essentially ceding your entire turn to deal with your opponent's dice that are on the board. This can be worth it if you can pull off something like a block and remove all of your opponent's dice. Let's say they roll 5 melee damage dice, and you go, I'll pay my 2. Block. Boosh. Turn over. Huge blowout card. The problem is, when you're building a deck, first of all, not every deck is even going to have melee damage. What if it's a Han Leia deck? There may not be a melee damage die in the whole deck, so you've got a dead card. Now, that's not that bad, because you can always just discard to reroll, but it is a dead card. But beyond that, even when there are melee damage, it's generally not worth giving up your whole turn unless your opponent gets the God roll, which will happen. But hopefully you'll have other ways to try to mitigate that. So we have the same problem with dodge, with range damage. We have these dice or these cards that take your whole turn to mitigate what your opponent is doing. This is usually not a good idea. Mind Trick also fits into this. Mind Trick is even more difficult because you have to have a blue character left. So if they kill your blue character, now it's a dead card. And when you're dividing your opponent's dice into 2 groups, I mean, generally this only works if they have a lot of dice, and if they're very good at the game, they're not going to be like, I'll put all my terrible dice here, all my good dice here. Oh, you picked the good dice, why would you do that? Normally they're going to be pretty smart and say like, okay, I rolled 2 high damage dice, boom, separate piles. I roll 2 things that are helping me in another way, 2 separate piles. So Mind Trick, again, is another card that I feel like is kind of a trap card. It feels awesome. You're going to play it a couple times and be like, wow, that card was amazing. But you really need to think about your resources. If you're not generating many resources in addition to your 2, that's costing a lot. I've already talked about Comlink in another video, and Comlink has the same problem, right? When you play this, it's your whole turn generally. The die itself is okay. If you're actually playing more for a long game where you're like trying to build to a Falcon or an ATST or something, I could see this maybe having a place in your deck because it has 2 resources. However, the problem is if you're using this defensively, you're taking your whole turn to play this card to reroll your opponent's dice and hoping they don't roll a God roll. So let's go ahead and look at the flip side of this. What could you be running instead of these 2 cost cards? And there's a whole bunch of really great cards in different colors and archetypes. Probably my favorite card in the whole game is Flank. If you are running a deck that has 3 characters in it, Flank becomes amazing. They roll their dice for 1 resource, half your turn, you pluck off their most important die. That can be such a blowout if they roll like a 2 range damage and then 2 +2s. And if you've been studying this game very much, you know that the +2s cannot resolve unless there's a regular. So you pull off that regular and they just look at their board and go, yeah, okay, that completely ruined my setup. Another just amazing card is the Best Defense. No matter what they roll, you get to yank off 2 of their best dice. Yes, it does 3 damage, but there's a lot of ways to get shields right now. There are a lot of cheap, good cards that give you shields. It's not that hard to find some sort of red character to shield them up and then use this. Of course, it's villain only, but it's still very powerful. Feel the Anger is a huge blowout card, much like Block and Dodge, but it only costs 1. It's kind of the opposite of Block and Dodge, where Block and Dodge are great against God rolls. Feel Your Anger is amazing against shaky rolls. Like, let's say your opponent is rolling an elite character with 3 upgrades. The odds are very good they'll roll a blank, and even 1 blank will often completely wreck their turn if you can pull off their 1 die, and if you can pull off 2 to 3, it just becomes a huge blowout. Negotiate and Use the Force also both fit into these spots of 1 resource cards that do a fair amount. Use the Force is cool because you can either use it offensively or defensively. Offensively, it's pretty dicey. They'll probably have a way. If you're like, I'll roll Vader. Okay, that wasn't what I wanted. I'll use the Force to make Vader a 3. Yeah, take that. Like, it's very unlikely that your opponent's just going to go, oh, I got nothing for that. Like, usually they'll have an answer. So, but Use the Force is really great if they roll their 1 side that just destroys you. Or once they take the battlefield, now Use the Force becomes incredibly powerful. In addition to just events, we also have other cards like, for instance, guns that have a varying amount of cost. And so I want to take a look at how this works in something like an upgrade. So you've got a 1, a 2, and a 3 here. So let's remember, a 2 is your whole turn. A 3 is you're saving for it or building to it, and a 1 is only half your turn and lets you play one of these other great cards I talked about. And so when I look at weapons like this, I'm incredibly wary to play a 3-cost weapon. A 3-cost weapon better just be baller. And when I look at something like the Blaster Rifle, its special's great, don't get me wrong. 2 unblockable damage is not bad at all. So it basically has 3 damage sides. 1 is a plus, which is usually somewhat of a negative depending on what's happening. It can actually be a positive. But if we compare this gun to the other guns, the Holdout Blaster also has 3 sides that are damaged. The Blaster Pistol for 1 also has 3 sides that are damaged. So when I look at the IQ-A11 Blaster Rifle, I'm not blown away by it. I, in fact, pretty much will never put it into a deck unless it's just a situation where I don't have enough weapons, which actually is still kind of the case. We have almost all the cards spoiled, so it looks like for decks that want to have a heavy amount of upgrade weapons, you may end up having to use a card like this that you don't really love. But I think going forward, as we see more sets, we'll see less and less of these 3-cost weapons seeing play, unless they're just really great. A good example of a card that I'm still a little bit torn on is the Lightsaber. Lightsaber is a 3-cost weapon, kind of similar to the Blaster Rifle in its dice sides, and it has an unblockable that deals 2 unblockable damage. But what it does do is has redeploy. So there's a whole suite of weapons that I'm going to talk about in another video that all have redeploy and have different usages. Alright, so Blaster Pistol, I love. It only costs 1. You're going to find out as you watch more of these videos, if it costs 1 and it's good, Tiny Grimes loves it. Not a huge fan of the 3. So the real question is, what about 2? Do you want to spend your whole turn for 1 gun? Moving forward in the future, in later sets, I'm not sure that I'll be so eager to do that. Right now, 2 seems to be a pretty normal spot. A lot of upgrades that do damage cost 2. This one has Ambush, which lets you take another action, and it also has Redeploy. So when this character dies, you get to move it around, so it's kind of this eternal weapon. And so for me, that sort of pushes it into playable territory, potentially good long-term territory. And certainly with various characters like Han, who gets a shield with Ambush, Rey, who when you play this on her gets 2 more actions, so you can do crazy things like roll a character, resolve their dice. This has increased value. But even the Holdout Blaster is a card where I think right now it's a staple and it'll be in pretty much any deck with ranged characters. Moving forward, we may not see this card as much. Another good example of that is Jetpack, which I don't have here, and you can look that one up. But that's another card that people play now, and I'm not sure they will in the future. And it's not that it's not decent, it's simply that it's 2 cost. It's your whole entire turn to play this card, which you're going to find is a huge impact. So let's take a look at some cards that I really like a lot because I think they're extremely cost effective. And not surprisingly, a lot of them are 0 and 1. So let's start with some of these zeros. Sith Holocron, I've already made a video about it, proclaiming that it was really good. Well, guess what? Almost all the cards have been spoiled now. Sith Holocron, still really good. Like, it pretty much powers a lot of decks. Now, there are more answers to it, which is great. It's not like a Holocron hits the board and you store your hands up and go, that's it, that's ball game. But a good example is when two Holocron decks meet. If one person gets one turn 1 and the other person doesn't see one until turn 5, that game you can pretty much guess the outcome just based on the Holocron. It is that good. It is a 0 cost upgrade that has a die, even if it didn't have an effect, and it just had a die that had really minimal stuff, it would be great. But it has a crazy effect which lets you cheat into play stuff with up to 4 cost. These upgrades that are just phenomenal and destroy the world. Another great card for cheap is Hit and Run. 0 cost. Love it. That's my cost point. You talk 0, I am looking. Ambush. We've already talked about Ambush with Han. Ambush giving you another action. And you get to activate one of your red characters. So basically what you do with Hit and Run is you play it, you turn a character into a mini Jango Fett, which means that they get to activate and then resolve some of their dice, which can be incredibly powerful. Hunker Down is going to be meta-defining. This is my prediction. Hunker Down is just insane. It's neutral and it's yellow. So pretty much every one of my decks right now is yellow because it's just that good. It's 0, okay? It's an upgrade. You put it on your character. Every single turn, you get to just take an action and get a free shield. I mean, that's insane. And the only way for them to get rid of it is to have a character take melee damage. And in order to do that, that means the damage has to go through the shield. So you play this on a turn. What I like to do is play it after my opponents have gone. If they have melee guys, play it, get a shield. I go next turn, get another shield. Now they have to roll 3 melee damage to be able to get rid of this, or I'm getting a shield every single turn. There's nothing more frustrating than dealing with reoccurring shields on reasonable characters. Alright, so those are all 0. They're all fantastic. At 1 cost, Scout is really, really strong. It's a great way to deal with something like Holocron. It's just a great way to get information about your opponent's hand. If you are running a range deck, one of your great fears is deflection. If your opponent is running blue, there's a decent chance they have deflection, and if you roll something great, they might deflect it. And so knowing whether they have it in their hand, maybe pulling it out of their hand, these can be incredibly useful tools. It only costs 1. It's only half of your turn. It generates a resource. It can take the resources. It's just a really strong card. It is a very good value. Immobilize is another card that you may be looking at me and going, whoa, Tiny, it's your whole turn. It's 2 costs. But Immobilize is just insane. First, it's reoccurring shields. Reoccurring shields are really, really good. But secondly, it is every single turn getting to take that awesome die that they rolled and just turning it to a blank. You don't have to roll Immobilize. I mean, it has to be on the field, but you don't have to roll a special or anything. Just as soon as they get a great die, you go, yeah, that is a really powerful die. That's true. That's a good point. Let's make it a blank. Super frustrating. And when you have 2 out, oh my goodness, it is crazy. Force Strike is a card that I haven't really seen anyone talking about. This card is bananas. It's basically a centerpiece of a burn style deck that's trying to do a whole bunch of damage pretty quick. You may be thinking, turn one of your blue dice to a side showing melee. I mean, there's not that many dice that I'm worried about. Like Vader, yeah, he's a 3, but he's crazy expensive. But you know what else this works with? Is Lightsaber. Being able to turn Lightsaber to that 3 side and just slam them for 3. Yeah, it will basically be pay 2 to turn it to do it. But what makes it so strong is it's not just turn it, it's immediately resolve it. So it's just simply, I love to use it with Vader. You roll Vader, 2 blanks, and your opponent's like, yes, I'm totally fine. That guy was down to 2 health left. I don't even need to worry about him until he re-rolls, and then I'll mitigate that roll. And you just go, boom, 1, Force Strike, turn it to a 3, kill your guy. And they're like, oh, that one, smarts. So these are just some of the cards that I think are incredibly good and really well valued. And if you notice, most of them are 0s and 1s because this gives you that opportunity to both play a card that advances your own board state and then maybe play a defensive card as well. And being able to balance that becomes really strong. Now there's a lot of cards that I don't really like in this first set, but I'm just going to talk about 4 of them. and they're ones that seem like they might be good, and that's why I want to talk about them. And notice, they're all 2 or more, right? So immediately, if you're playing a card for 2, that's your turn. So, and this is where things become really dicey. Raised Staff is a card that's in the starter deck, and you think, that's not bad, right? Like, it's got 3 damage sides, it's got kind of a cool special, but it's your whole turn, and 2 of the sides are only 1 damage, and the other side costs a resource in addition. So every time you're rolling that, it's costing you 1. So I've generally found that while this is a fine card in the starter set, moving forward, Raised Staff becomes less and less appealing to put in decks. Jedi Robes is one where you may be looking at me like I'm insane. But Jedi Robes is your whole turn after turn 1. Turn 1 is pretty good, but after that, 2 resources for a shield and a really mediocre die. Now you might be thinking, and it is cool to do this, to do something like Jedi Robes, and then the next turn, you only pay, say, 1 more to overwrite it with a Force Throw. And so it took you 2 cards and 3 resources, but it's fine because you got value out of it, and that's true. But generally speaking, I'm not excited ever to take my whole turn to play Jedi Robes. And this is really interesting change because before all the cards got spoiled, this had a key place in a lot of decks. But now, as there's more choices, more better choices, I look at this card and I say, it's just too expensive for what it is. Like, it's not a bad card necessarily, but your whole turn for this is pretty underwhelming. Prized Possession, to me, I don't understand this card. How is it 4? So you play this upgrade, and you get to remove an opponent's character die, and then they can't roll it anymore. I mean, it costs 4. So for 4, you get to remove one of your opponent's dice. Well, the problem is, for 4, they could be playing 3 upgrades. You know, a 2-coster and 2 1-costers. I'm just not sure you're getting enough value out of a card like this. I mean, it's pretty cool. Like if they've got 1 die of Akbar and they're running some sort of mill deck and you can lock them out of that. That could be a really great use. But generally speaking, I've looked at this card and every time I analyze decks, I'm like, nope, nope. And it doesn't even make like the top 40 where I'm cutting it out. It's always like number 50. So it's just a card that I can't get behind, and it's all because of the cost. If it was 2 cost, I'd look at that and go, that's kind of cool actually. Like, I don't know if it's going to be great, but I'll test it at 2. At 4, whew, that's real expensive. And the last one that's a pretty good card again is Daring Escape. It has a really cool effect, right? Reroll any number of an opponent's dice, then remove all of their dice showing blanks. So, like, you can reroll, they already have 2 blanks, you reroll 3 more of their dice, 2 of them come up blank, boosh, their turn is basically exploded into oblivion. And it has ambush, so even if it backfires, you have a chance to follow up with another play. And it's a great card. Problem, it costs 2! It's your whole turn! Like, how can you take your whole turn to just re-roll some of your opponent's dice and hope that they don't wreck you? Like, that to me is just an almost unplayable card because it is so expensive. And it's going to be really interesting as we move forward if we can break out of this, if we can find enough, if we can find a deck that's just like, I make money hand over fist. But I don't think that's going to be norm. And so in the norm, all of these cards are fine in their own right. In another game where resources were plentiful, these would all be cool cards. But here in Star Wars Destiny, I just can't get behind any of them. So the last type of cards I want to talk about are really expensive supports. Really expensive upgrades that have crazy abilities are quite playable. Because all you do is you just overwrite a cheaper thing and get it out. But supports are a whole nother matter. In order to play the Falcon, in order to play the ATST, you gotta plunk down the cash for these bad boys. That is not easy to do. However, once they're out, they do crazy amounts of damage. So I'm a little bit unsure of what to even say about these. They obviously are way overcosted for just, say, a regular deck, right? Like, I'm getting 2 per turn, and I'm going to take the next 3 turns and save up for this ATST and not put any cards on the board or play any mitigating effects. That will mean you get blown out of the building. So what's going to be interesting is if we can find decks in which we can generate resources really quickly to make these cards better. The problem, of course, with these cards is, let's say you save up your 6 and you roll your 5 range damage. It's going to kill a guy. Like, that is going to kill a guy. The problem is there are so many cards that will handle that. Just in the cards that we looked at already, every one of the 1-costers handles it. Most of the 2-costers handles it. Deflect. Deflect will remove that die and do 3 damage back to one of your characters. So these super expensive supports are really hard to get behind because they're so expensive and there's so many ways to mess with your opponent's dice. So I'm going to be really interesting to see if a deck can emerge that uses these 2 cards and others like it really effectively by generating a ton of resources. I think you're going to need to generate a lot of actions as well, so that you are forcing your opponent to take the battlefield first, so that then you can roll these afterwards, or you're running cards, a lot of cards where you're looking at their hand, which do exist. So you look at their hand, you figure out what they have. Okay, they don't have a deflect, they don't have mitigation. I can actually roll this turn and maybe actually do 5 damage, which would be really impactful. So I can't wait to see what kind of decks we end up building that use these. But generally speaking, the way I play this game can be summarized right here. 1 or 2. Does it cost 1 or does it cost 2? If it costs 1, I'm loving that card if it has high impact. If it costs 2, whew, it better be really, really good. And let's end with reversal. This card's awesome. You get to remove their die and deal that much damage to a character, but it costs 3. It's not even your whole turn. It's a turn and a half to remove 1 die. I don't know about that. You want to remove one of your opponent's dice, or do you want to play 2 upgrades that give you dice? I don't know. We'll just leave it there. I think this game is very fascinating in having this extremely limited resource development every turn, so that you're left with these really interesting deck building choices, these really interesting playing choices. Do you play the huge, awesome blowout cards for high cost, or do you gravitate more towards the ultra efficient cheap cards? Now, I'm going to say for myself, I'm an ultra efficient cheap guy, but some of you I know out there are just going to blow out people with these super expensive cards, and it'll be a lot of fun. So hopefully this was illuminating in some way, and I'll see you next time on Tiny Grimes Games.